Hello, returning happies and new listeners. This is Steve Bennett Martin.
And this is Stephen Martin Bennett.
And welcome to A Lifetime of Happiness, the podcast where we take you on our journey through some of the movies, television shows, and other bits of pop culture that are helping to keep us happy, while hopefully bringing a smile to your face along the way.
And today we're talking about, oh my God, babe, what's wrong with your eyes?
Itchy. Tasty.
Not again. Good thing we keep the vaccine for the T-virus handy.
Much better. You know, we really should take down that umbrella corporation so this stops happening to me.
I agree. But first, let's talk about our favorite horror video game series, Resident Evil.
Sure thing, my love. But first, what's making you happy?
So, it's two things. I had a really fun weekend with Mr. Remykins, and we went hiking. So, you know, I walked children in nature. And that was lovely, but I'm also really enjoying Paper Mario, the Origami King for the Nintendo Switch.
Excellent. What are you enjoying about it?
It's this really quirky take on the Mario Brothers world. The combat is interesting. I love the exploration and the puzzles, and it's fitting into this weird little niche that just tickles my funny bone, so I'm enjoying it a whole bunch.
Well, excellent. I'm glad that you're enjoying it after the last entry in the series didn't really make much of a big impact for you.
Sticker star sucks.
Yes.
But what about you, darling? What's making you happy?
Well, you were walking children in nature with Remy because I was away at SoberCon, and that was a blast.
What is SoberCon?
Well, it was a conference about sobriety, and I renamed it SoberCon because it just sounds flashier, and I feel like I should do some of the marketing for my groups.
I mean, I enjoy the name SoberCon. It was probably something like, you know, alcohol awareness conference.
It was just because we go for anonymity. It was all just called the Florida State Conference.
Oh, yeah, SoberCon's better.
Yeah, SoberCon is better. But in addition to that, I've been enjoying a love-hate relationship with Pokemon Unite.
Yes.
It is the new Fortnite-esque kind of Pokemon game where it's not a matter of catching them all or beating the Elite Four. It's timed matches where you have a certain limited number of time to level your Pokemon up, make it evolve, and score goals on the opposing team.
How do you score goals?
You defeat each other to take each other's points, and you get points by defeating wild Pokemon while you're also fighting other people in real life.
So you make the Pokemon faint.
Yes, you do. And it's one of those games where I really love it when I'm winning. It's awesome. But when I'm losing, I'm ready to throw my controller. And that's not normally the type of video gamer that I am.
No.
But I also think it's why I'm the type of video gamer that normally doesn't play online multiplayer games like that. Because it does bring out a side of me that I'm not huge on. But luckily, I win more often than I lose.
Well, that's lovely. And something else that's interesting, and it's entirely to your credit, we can now look at our little baby and tell him to sit.
Yes, and he sits 9 out of 10 times now, which is 9 more times out of 10 than he used to a couple weeks ago.
Yes, because he was not one to sit, stay, roll over, high five, any of that sort of thing. Like, we couldn't even get him to come to us. The only people that can do that are my parents, and all they have to do is go, or, come here, Remy, come here, and he comes running towards them. I can look at him, you can look at him and go, Remy, come here, and he just looks at us like, you're not Nana and Papal, what are you talking about?
Yeah, and then I also have been enjoying today, before this recording, watching the World Ends With You anime. It's on Hulu, and it is subtitled, so you do need to read the story, but it's a great way for me to catch up before I play the sequel, Neo Ends With You, without having to replay that first game.
And the first game came out for the 3DS?
Yes, it did. And then they did a port for the Switch that I think you'd love one day, because it does have an amazing story, but I wasn't ready to play through the full game to play the sequel. So the anime is stylish, it gives you the highlights, it gives you the beat, and it even makes the combat like call back to the game in like a really flashy, awesome way. So
that's fun.
I'm a fun trip through that right now.
Well, wonderful. And I guess with all the things about us out of the way, that brings us to Resident Evil.
Yes, and for those of you who don't know, Resident Evil is also known as Biohazard in the East and pretty much everywhere else but America. It is a Japanese horror video game series and franchise created by Capcom.
Its primary gameplay would be considered a shooter, although the gameplay is involved and literally gone on and off the rails. And, they've gone from the start where it was like controlling a little tank.
Yes.
To over the shoulder to first person. So it's been a lot of different things over the years.
Yes, it has. In addition to a lot of different types of games, the franchise has also expanded to include a live-action film series.
Which had very little to do with the games.
Yes. It had animated films, comic books, novels, audio dramas, and has an upcoming Netflix live-action series.
Super excited for that.
Yes, me too. So, with this being the best-selling franchise for Capcom, it has sold over 110 million units across the series as of March 31st, 2021.
And it can also be credited with bringing zombies as scary things back into pop culture.
Yes, even George Romero said, his movies after the 90s were really heavily inspired by Resident Evil. The first game came out in 1996 for the PlayStation and was created by Shinji Mikami and Takuro Fujiwara. And yes, it definitely brought zombies back into pop culture. I don't think we'd have The Walking Dead if it wasn't for Resident Evil.
Probably not. And because we had gone through a series where zombies had also become comedy.
Yes.
Like the Return of the Living Dead series in the late 80s into the 90s were definitely more skewing towards comedy. And so this brought the horror aspect back.
Yes, it did, because when those dogs jumped through that window in the first one, everyone threw their controllers, squealed out loud if they were anything like me.
And that was me.
Yes, exactly.
That was exactly my first experience with survival horror. I had a PlayStation. I had it set up in my bedroom. I turned off all the lights. I closed the blinds and sat down to play it. And the first opening sequence was cinematic. I believe it was actually shot with people.
Yeah.
And then you get into the mansion and you're wandering around and you get upstairs and you're going down this hallway and there's lightning striking outside and you walk 5 steps and this demon dog breaks through the window. I tossed the controller up into the air. I screamed out loud. And it was years before I went back to the game.
Yes. Well, I played through it. I remember playing it at sleepovers at Drew's house where all of us would be playing it. And one person would have the controller, but everyone around was like, go there. No, watch out for that. And we'd have to trade off the controller when it got to be too scary or whatever. But it was really a great start to the franchise. It's become since then the best-selling horror game series across the industry. And it's also the highest grossing franchise of a film adaptation of video games.
And a lot of people in the horror and zombie genres rate this as their favorite or right near the top. And it's nice that, a video game adaptation movie did well in the theater, because growing up, we only had the Super Mario Brothers movie.
Which did not do well in the theaters.
No, that had too many cooks in the kitchen on that one.
Yes. But all the games in the series are about biohazards of one form or another being released in a fictionalized version of our world. Mm-hmm. So the name Biohazard really makes a lot more sense than Resident Evil for the series.
Right.
Although it kind of fits for that first one because they were in a house. And
that
the resident
mansion
was evil, that mansion.
Yeah.
But why was the series called Resident Evil in the United States, babe?
Because there was a crappy DOS-based game and a New York-based punk band that all shared the name Biohazard, so it would be impossible for Capcom to register the game.
Yeah, Chris Kramer said that it would be impossible for it, so as a result, the head of marketing held a company-wide contest to come up with a new name, even though Chris himself voted against it for being super cheesy.
I would love to hear what the other top 9 out of 10 entries in that contest were.
Yes.
If Resident Evil was the top choice.
Yeah.
I would love to hear what the other 9 were.
Yeah, I can imagine one would be zombies, zombies, zombies.
So, for those of you who have not played Resident Evil and plan to play it in the future, be forewarned. We're about to spoil the hell out of it.
Yes, we certainly will. Won't go into specific plot points in depth, but we will spoil enough of it, I'm sure, to give you the idea. Then again, it's not like you really play these games for the story. You play them for the environment, for the feel, for the action. But yes, we will be talking about the plot points. I know the earlier installments focused on a group of people battling against the Umbrella Corporation and their secret bioorganic weapons research division.
Right. It would be like if Pfizer had a shady underbelly and got everyone to take a vaccine, and it was secretly a biohazard weapon. Oh, God, babe. Oh, no.
I know.
300 million people now have the T virus in America, not to mention the millions, even billions across the world. Oh, no. COVID wasn't real. It was just them getting us to take the T virus vaccine.
Slow down, Karen. Sorry, Mom.
Just kidding. COVID's real. The vaccine is safe. We were making a joke.
Yes, I remember though when I spent my little stint working as part of the CVS Corporation, like I definitely like around orientation went around to a couple people and I'm like, "Where's the bioorganic weapons division?" And no one seemed to get it. But yes, it would be along those lines of that if one of the leading healthcare industries in the world was secretly testing for bioorganic weapons.
Right.
And so this took place in Raccoon City, which is a fictional Midwestern city that had outlying areas housing several bioengineering laboratories belonging to Umbrella. In the movies, we learned they were called the Hive,
yes,
which is canon now in the games as well.
And I also love that it's the Umbrella Corporation because it is an overarching company that is involved in agriculture, technology, biology, healthcare, so many things. It's an umbrella. It's kind of like these days where, Amazon has its hand in so many things, or Warner Brothers and AT&T whenever they had their movies and phones, and so it really works. And also, it's a cool name.
Yeah, and they had, speaking of cool names, they had a group of STARS, which was an elite task force investigating a missing team member, but STARS stands for the Special Tactics and Rescue Services. So what do you think of that name?
Spelled out, stupid. STARS itself, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like, oh, I love the name SHIELD, but Strategic Homeland, burr.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, but they soon find themselves in the mansion, and that is where the first game takes place, the majority of it.
And that's where we get introduced to best character in the Resident Evil franchise, Jill Valentine.
Yes, unless you had like your daddies, in which case Chris might have been your favorite. But I already can tell. Why do you love Jill so much?
Because she's a badass female.
Yes, she certainly is. I also remember choosing her because in the original game, they each had their own kind of different benefits. Like Chris could take like an extra attack or two without dying, while Jill came with a lockpick earlier on. So there were certain things when you choose that only she can have access to. So that's why I liked her from the tactical standpoint. But you're right, she is also just a badass.
Yeah, you're giving all these good reasons, and I'm sitting there remembering. Okay, so short story.
Yeah.
When they have March Madness and they have the office pools where you pick who's going to win?
Sure.
So it's a thing. And Dia did really well one year, basing it on uniform colors and styles. Mm-hmm. She had no idea about the team. She was like...
And she probably did awesome.
She did. And so it reminds me of my choice of Jill in the way that she did really well in March Madness, basing it on the cute uniforms.
Yeah. Meanwhile, with the Jill and Chris and the other members of STARS that they run into, like they're looking for Rebecca. They have, other members that they encountered during. Barry was one of them, wasn't it?
There's, oh goodness, yeah.
But
they also they have a teammate. There's Albert Wesker, who anybody that's played the series knows that name.
Yes, he ends up being the double traitor, or he was a double agent working for Umbrella as well as for STARS. So he ends up being the super bad guy who plans to use the Tyrant, which is a giant humanoid super soldier infected with the T-virus, to kill the remaining STARS agents.
And a lot of the times that they're releasing these giant things like the Tyrant or Nemesis, because they want to see how they will do in field tactics so that they can possibly sell these things to governments to use as
Weapons.
soldiers in war.
Yes.
Isn't that always nice?
It is always nice. Definitely purely fiction. I can never imagine anyone doing something like that in real life.
I mean, just like in Jurassic World.
Yes.
Like, they were breeding certain types of dinosaurs, and governments were going to buy them to let loose the dinosaurs against countries in war.
This is why we can't have nice things.
It's for damn sure.
Yes, but this one ended up leading to a trilogy of games that happened all roughly at the same time. It led to the second one, featured Leon Kennedy.
Who is second best Resident Evil character, in my opinion.
Yes, and Claire Redfield, who's Chris's younger sister. They are in Raccoon City, and they encounter the G virus, a deadlier version of the T virus, ultimately taking down Dr. Birkin, who worked for Umbrella and was the creator of the virus, with the help of Ada Wong and Hunk. Meanwhile, saving Dr. Birkin's daughter, Sherry, and the cure.
And that was kind of had a little skew where they used that in the movies with the, I think it was Resident Evil 2, where the doctor's daughter was in the city and they had to get her out, and she was the basis for the Red Queen in the mansion in the first one, and it was a whole thing.
Yeah, they found a way in the sequels to tie it back to the games a little bit more.
Right.
But that one, I just remember the police station, and
Oh
while
my
it did
gosh.
have other areas of the game, that's where you spent a big chunk of it, whether you played as Leon or Claire.
Because that was the one that you had, what was the thing that was chasing you through?
Mr. X, I think it was Mr. X through the hallways of the police station.
And that was just one of those things, especially because you recently did the RE2 remake.
Yes.
And where they updated the graphics, some quality of life improvements.
So good.
And it was really good. I like when you do games like this so that it's like a movie for me.
Yeah.
And I get to watch a horror action movie while you have the stress of dealing with all the controls and things, where I just can sit there with ice cream and be like, this is great.
And you love seeing me when I freak out with the jump scares.
I do. It's the best.
Yes, that's why you also really loved when I was doing the Resident Evil 3 remake recently, because that is when Jill is trying to escape Raccoon City at the same time as Resident Evil 2 is going on, but she's facing her own challenges in the form of Nemesis, who hardcore is stalking you and chasing you throughout the game. She ultimately escapes and kills Nemesis with the help of Carlos Rodriguez.
Yes, and that was another really great remake. I love that Capcom is doing this, where they're going back to some of their games and they're like, the technology wasn't there back then. We did what we could, but now let's make it the best game possible.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that.
I do too. Yes, so the first trilogy ends up with Raccoon City being nuked by Umbrella to try and cover up everything. But because our heroes survive, we find out that, the name Umbrella was never able to recover from it. So the company ended up ultimately failing, but they weren't wiped out completely.
No.
They just ended up failing. So you still have some of the scientists and things laying out there just
You've got all the dark money.
Exactly, just in case it leads to anywhere else. Which it does, because the series does continue on from there. But before we get into that, what are some of your favorite highlights from the first trilogy?
So, I mean, the mansion itself is just really, really interesting. I love the way that whenever they first built it, the graphics for it back on the original PlayStation were more impressive than they should be, because they were pre-rendered backgrounds.
Yes, they were.
That were going to be there, and their character just moved through it. So
that continued on to 2 and 3 as well. It was
did.
only in Code Veronica where they started having their own renderings.
Yes. And I didn't care for the controls in the first, like the whole tank controls, not a fan. But I love that this created this wonderful genre with this story and characters that kept moving, and it was creating this great universe where it was different every time, though it was following a storyline. Like, I love the Zelda games, but they're not known for the really originality in their story, except for maybe Breath of the Wild, which was totally original, but it's usually
princess,
get the sword, save the sages, save the princess type of thing, where this is really unique for each installment of the series.
Yeah, and I really feel like they are really fleshed out in their plot. It follows from one to the next really well. But just, I mean, it's when I fell in love with the idea of like the locations kind of being their own character. Because that Spencer Mansion had its own history and its own story. And you go into the second one, the police station is just alive with, you know, the history of the, like, it actually felt like people worked there up until this was happening. And like you could see the little pieces of life left over, reading the journal entries. It's one of the first games where I would really read the codexes, as they normally call them in RPGs, and just like the journal entries, like where I got Tasty Itchy from. It just is something that, you know, reading through those stories kind of it just really connected you to it. And then in 3, it was a little more all over, but you got to see, in my opinion, more of the city itself.
Which Raccoon City is probably the name most associated with the Resident Evil series.
Oh, yes.
Like, you can say Raccoon City, and anybody that has even cursory knowledge, they're like, oh, that's Resident Evil.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we now know isn't realistic, like, you have all these people running from zombies and the plague trying to fight it, where if they were making something realistic, you would have to have half the citizens running towards the zombies screaming fake news.
Yeah, exactly. But we also didn't know where our real world would end up going when this came out in the 90s. So maybe in Resident Evil 9, like, it'll be a little bit better. But yes, the game series does continue on with Resident Evil Code Veronica, probably one of the ones most in need of a facelift now, or a port, because it has not been remade or ported half as much as the previous entries into the series, or even the following ones. Right now, I believe that's the only one that you can't get on the Nintendo Switch.
That is, well, you can't get 2 or 3.
Oh, you can either?
No, you can do 0 and remake 4, 5, and 6.
Okay, well, that makes sense because 2 and 3 are also on the PlayStation exclusively. So, yes, but it is a direct sequel to Resident Evil 2, following Claire and her brother Chris from Rockford Island, which is a prison in the Southern Ocean, to Antarctica, taking on the Ashford family and Wesker.
Again with the Wesker.
Yes, he truly is the Michael Myers of Resident Evil villains. You kill him in every single one and he keeps on coming back.
It's amazing how that happens.
Yes. But that's the one where he, like, admits, like, he is more than human now. Because at first, like, you thought he was just human working for them. But then he shows up and he's like, no, I actually have superpowers and I'm super bad, too.
Because he's been experimenting on himself like Hank McCoy in the X-Men.
Yes, who is also a villain, for those of you who don't understand that his gray area-ness is oftentimes more blue than gray.
Yeah. Resident Evil 0 came out later on, and I love that they call it 0 so they could have a prequel.
Yes.
And it deals with STARS member Rebecca and convict Billy, who are there and taking down Dr. Marcus, who combined with the T-virus with leech DNA, and it's known a lot for Train.
Yeah, the Train is, you know, like I mentioned, like every game has one location that is just unique in some ways or special, and that's where the game starts off, is just on these trains. But I just remember between that and the gameplay of tagging off between two, because you've had games like Resident Evil 2 where you have Chris's or Leon's route and Claire's route.
Yep.
Yes, but this was the first time where, like, you can be fighting with, like, Billy and then swap to Rebecca and back and forth.
And I could be wrong if I'm remembering incorrectly, doesn't the train crash somewhere near the mansion?
Yes, you end up, like, finding yourself in the basement, basically, of the mansion. It's its own little separate adventure that doesn't really have much of an impact canonically, but I do remember it being a very fun train ride.
Now, my favorite entry in the series is the one where they started changing things a great deal to kind of modernize it, and that was Resident Evil 4, which got universal acclaim when it came out.
Near perfect reviews across every board that reviews video games.
Yep. Leon returns to the series, and he travels to Europe to save the president's daughter, Ashley, one of the most annoying characters. So one of the things in the Resident Evil series, you'll have a character that you have to watch out for.
Yeah.
That you have to make sure that they're not attacked by any of the things. And even though you may be doing well, if you leave them alone and they die, you lose.
Yes, but normally, like, even with, as we mentioned with Resident Evil Zero, like, I remember playing as Billy, and like I would occasionally have to tag out into Rebecca, like if her health was getting low. But like typically they both had guns, they both could swap inventory back and forth.
Not the president's kid.
I was gonna say, like, they could defend one another to a certain point before you had to jump in. But no, not with the president's daughter. Ashley was just a flailing, useless person, wasn't she?
Yes, and this time it's not exactly the T-virus, it's the Las Plagas, and they totally corrupted an entire European village with these worm-like things that go inside the people, and kind of like you shoot them, and some of the stronger ones you blow their head off, and this thing comes up with all these tentacles, and you have to watch out before it gets close to you because it'll pierce you and cause a lot of damage. It's all very exciting, but one of the best things that changed was instead of the tank controls where it was a third person further back perspective, this was kind of an over the shoulder perspective.
Yes.
And
it's the first one where like Leon felt like he can move around and run around,
and it didn't feel as awkward with the characters moving, and you got Ada Wong back, and definitely a gray area character, but more in the good side.
Yes. Meanwhile, it also, that one I would say, like, I always remember that first village that you enter into the game as like the one where it's timed and you have the chainsaw guy coming after you.
And it's just this thing where they're relentless at the beginning, and it's interesting that, you know, at the beginning you don't have much ammo, you don't really have any health things, and you have to be super creative from the get-go to survive, because once you get past that and then you go to the farmhouse in some areas, you definitely have more of a chance to breathe. But it feels like that first area through the village, you're just go, go, go.
Yes, I certainly remember that feeling. That also is the scene of a fanfic I wrote of it, remember?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
That you also get the weapon seller where he's like, what are you buying? Is that all, stranger?
Yes, and you loved when you were watching me play Resident Evil Village and how the taglines keep coming like back in the newer series.
Yep, that made me very happy.
Yes. And then while that was the most critically acclaimed entry in the series, the best selling is Resident Evil 5. It did receive mixed reception. At first, there was claims of racism, although it just ended up being that it was set in Africa. Mm-hmm. Like, it didn't really feel racist because it had, like, people of different color that were zombies, so it just was probably advertised not the best way at first.
I think that's definitely what it was.
Because once it came out, that whole
went away.
Whole controversy stopped.
And I honestly think that this was the best-selling one because of how good 4 was. People were ready to jump on.
Yes, and also it was released ultimately on more systems, I believe.
Because at that point, it was able to go to the Xbox and the PlayStation,
yep.
where at that point you really just had everyone.
Yes, exactly. It took place 5 years after Resident Evil 4. Chris now is working for BSAA, which is still around today in the series. It's the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance. And he's
not as flashy sounding as STARS, but the name makes more sense.
Yes, it does. And he's partnered with Shiva Alamar to apprehend Ricardo Irving, arms dealer or drug dealer, before he can sell a BOW on the black market.
Which is a bioorganic weapon.
Yes, and they are facing off with the Las Plagas again, although it's a different
strain
of
yeah.
it. And ultimately, a mind-controlled Jill Valentine, who we had previously thought was dead at the beginning of the game in a face-off against Wesker, but then it ends up he was just mind-controlling her. They end up saving her, and they finally kill Wesker. As of Resident Evil 8, Wesker is still dead. I can't promise that he'll stay dead forever because video games are like comics in that way.
I mean, with the technology that they have, I would say as long as they had some DNA, they could easily clone a new Wesker if they needed it.
Yes.
And this was definitely a big change for the environment of the series. As you mentioned, it's in Africa. So you had some, desert situations in daylight more, because a lot of the games take place at dusk or at night. Because even the parts of 4 that were not at night
they
weren't even, it wasn't bright sunny, and you had more of that in 5.
Yeah, this was a bright sunny day when it first starts off. I remember that first village, just the brightness of it all was just very surprising, and going in and out of the house, and like, because it's almost like when it's brighter outside, like inside
It's less scary.
Well, also like inside feels darker,
Right.
And so when you go into the houses and it's like pitch black, like you really feel it almost more because you were just outside and the sun's right behind you.
And some of the people complained that it was too action focused at this point, that it was losing the survival horror aspect.
Well, then they shouldn't have spoken just yet, because Resident Evil 6 comes out, and that's the most actiony of
Non-survival
all
horror, yeah.
Can't even think that you would call it a survival horror game at that point. It's been some time since I played it, but I tried to even like read the summaries of the plot as to what happened in that game, because I remember like it was very interesting because it had like 3 or 4 different stories.
Because you had Leon in Tall Oaks, which I keep wanting to say Tall Oaks, California, but I don't think that's where it is. It was a city kind of like Raccoon City. You had Chris in China.
Yes, and I remember that because at one point he like played, or you were fighting against like a fucking like zombie tiger thing. and you had Sherry Birkin was a playable controller with Jake Miller, and so you have like all these different stories. But I remember at some point like some of the stories kind of overlapped, but it certainly was no love. It was no Love Actually, where they all make sense in the end, or they're all connected.
And it was after that game that even people were saying, you know, Capcom flushed the series down the toilet. There's no way you can come back from this. And that's whenever you started hearing, well, they're just going to reboot the series.
Yes. And they did and they didn't with Resident Evil 7, Biohazard. It was their way of kind of blending the Eastern and Western audiences with the title. Mm-hmm. And it definitely returned the game to its horror roots. It switched to...
So much so, my goodness.
Oh, yeah, especially... I mean, it did come out in VR. We did not play it with the PlayStation VR.
I don't think I could have handled it.
Exactly, because even watching it on the screen, I remember when you were in the first person climbing through the hole in the wall with the bugs and everything. It was done very well, and it features Ethan Winters as he faces off against the Baker family.
And Ethan Winters is just a normal human, no real experience, right?
Exactly. And they do this thing where there are pictures of him where you see him from outside, like, and you see him, but like you never see his face, because it's the first person idea.
And it has the Baker family, which gives you more of a Texas Chainsaw Massacre family vibes to the whole thing.
Especially at first when you're like tied down to the table and watching them all eat a meal.
Yeah. And like in the earlier games where you had Nemesis or Mr. X and things chasing you through the whole game, with this you have different members of the Baker family coming after you, like the father and the mother, depending on where you were in the game. And they were
scary.
They were scary.
Rather than being a virus, it was a mold that caused it. And he was in that location to try and save his wife, Mia, which canonically he did save, although depending on how you play through it, might have been differently. It does end that way because the story does continue with Resident Evil Village. And the way they did Village with VILL, it still had
VIII.
Well, whatever.
Well, so that it looks like Roman numerals for 8.
8, exactly, yes. And so that's where he goes to save his daughter, Rosemary, after a fateful encounter with Chris Redfield, where his wife, Mia, apparently ends up dead.
Allegedly. And then that one was really good as well. Again, they kept the aspect to it. They kept the definitely survival horror aspect to it again. And it feels like this reboot was definitely what the game needed, because you're hearing a lot more acclaim for 7 and 8 again.
Yes, and I really like they tied together so nicely that spoiler, like I mentioned with spoiler alerts, but like the fact that you're playing through 8 and you realize like at the 11th hour that Ethan died at the very beginning of Resident Evil 7, and that like he didn't realize it because the mold brought him back to life, and he was able to like successfully like blend with the mold like the villains did, but like in a good guy kind of way. Just like blows my mind that like you went through like basically 2 full games of him with this like twist that, you know, when you go back, it makes perfect sense, because when Lady D ends up chopping off your fucking hand and you end up putting it on, throwing some holy water on it, and it's all good to go. You're like, I was like, when she first sliced off the hand, I screamed.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, oh my God.
Oh, and so, yeah, that was the 12-foot tall woman that the internet fetishized.
Yes, they fell in love with her.
And she's dressed in Victorian garb and a big hat, and she's full-bodied and beautiful, and it was definitely one of those characters that took the internet by storm.
Yes.
That there were memes of her and fan fiction months before the game came out.
I was gonna say, and I've seen like games where you can create your own character, people modding it so that it's her, and just like seeing her play these different games and having these different situations. She definitely was a very fun part of the game with the internet appeal.
Yes, very much so. And it just, I don't know, I really enjoyed where they went with this, and I look forward to seeing where they go with 9 now.
Yes. I have a feeling that Ethan's story is now done because he died really bad at the end.
Yeah, and it also said
he also died
this
Heroes.
Is the end of the father's story.
Exactly, which makes me think it's going to be his daughter Rosemary in the next one, because she has a little bit of power herself.
And I wouldn't hate it, though, if they find a way to bring back like Claire or Leon or Chris Redfield as a playable thing in the future.
Yeah, because Chris keeps on coming back into these games. He's been the one that, like, in recent entries, I mean, he was in 5, then you saw him in, like, you could play as him in 6 again, and then he was in 7 and 8 as, like, the guest character, kind of the the antagonist. What do you call the gray area one? Because you think that he's a bad guy for most of it.
Oh.
Anti-hero?
Anti-hero.
Yeah. Of course, it ends up that he was good all along, and it was all just the misunderstandings, because the bad guy from Village was actually in Mia's body at the beginning. When you saw Chris kill his wife, he was actually killing the bad guy who wasn't all the way dead.
And what I loved is that Resident Evil Village very much looked like it was set in the exact same place as Resident Evil 4.
But it was winter, so, I mean, I don't know how that would have worked, but it could have been. It definitely was. It combined the action from 4 and 5 with the horror aspects of like 7 and the original ones. So it was, if you haven't played the newest 2, go do that, because it's definitely fun. Yes. But it's also had its fair share of spin-off games, hasn't it?
Yes, and I loved most of them, honestly. So you had Resident Evil Revelations, which was them trying to do their first created solely for the handheld Resident Evil game.
Yeah.
And it came out for the Nintendo 3DS, and you are starting out as Jill Valentine, and you're working for the BSAA, and you're sent out to check out this ghost ship.
Yeah.
And you're exploring, and there's the virus and zombies, and Chris ends up showing up, and the story goes back and forth, and you're playing as multiple different people, and it was really good. I loved the puzzles in it. The horror aspect was fantastic. It felt very much like a Resident Evil 4 type of game on a portable.
Yeah.
Revelations 2 came out. I don't feel like it was as successful.
It also came out in chapters, didn't it?
It did. It came out in like 4 chapters, I believe, and it takes place canonically between 5 and 6. Claire Redfield is the star, and she's on a deserted island in the Baltic Sea. And
that's not so deserted after all.
No, but we also get a Wesker, but it's not. It's not our usual.
It's not Albert Wesker.
It is his sister, Alex.
Oh, did she survive in the end?
No.
Okay, well then, long story short, Alex existed for a moment.
Yeah, she sure did. But it was definitely interesting that it was another Wesker, and I like that the Weskers have this infatuation with the virus.
Yes.
And infecting themselves to try to be super beings.
Yeah.
So the Wii came along, and it was not strong enough to run a new like Resident Evil game. They did Resident Evil 4 for it, and that they said was the definitive edition because of the aiming with the Wiimote, and it was fantastic.
Yeah.
But so they created on-rails shooters that covered parts of the Resident Evil universe. So you had Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles that covered Resident Evil 0, 1, and Nemesis, dealing with the rise and fall of the Umbrella Corporation.
Yep.
And that was interesting how they did it. Those games were not easy. You could replay the sections to try to
get better scores
and find more of the secret things. And I like that. Dark Side Chronicles came out, and that covered 3 and Code Veronica with a little more focus on the personal stories because it was doing it as a prequel to Resident Evil 4. For those of us that only had the Wii at that time and no other console, I was taking what I could get in terms of Resident Evil games. Yeah. I'm glad that those were, 2 and done with the Resident Evil series. I don't think we need to go back to an on-rail shooter, but I'm glad I played them.
Yeah, I can certainly imagine. And I know one addition, while it's not a spin-off in its own right, it is a very common practice since the beginning that when you beat the game, you can replay it with bonus points that you get for completing things to then make it easier to play through, such as infinity ammo and things like that. But something that they started, I believe it was in 5, but I think they added a version of it for 4 in recent ports, is the Mercenaries mode.
And they actually, you could buy Resident Evil Mercenaries for the 3DS. That was close to being one of the launch games for for the 3DS.
Yeah, and so it's like this game that it strips away the story, puts you in smaller areas, and gives you a certain number of time to kill as many zombies as you can, and you can get points for racking them up by multiple kills in a short period of time.
And they've definitely evolved it so that it is better than it started as, because when I saw you doing it for 8, it was a lot more interesting than the 3DS version.
It was, although I wasn't as good at it in Resident Evil 8. I don't know what I was doing wrong, but I was killing all the zombies, and I still wasn't getting enough scores, so I guess I need to work on my multipliers. But yes, it was definitely I like the game. What do you think of that as something that you get for beating the game?
I think that is a nice reward, especially, and I kind of see if they're using this as a testing type of thing to maybe create a Resident Evil online multiplayer.
Well, that's what they did also with 8. It came with its own disc for an MMO that you can play for Resident Evil. I forget what it was called, but it was add-on. It was like an add-on game where it was you can play online, and it just was something that was not for me. As we learned even with Pokemon Unite, if I can't take Pokemon and turn it into a nice experience playing it with strangers and causing me anxiety, I can only imagine if you added in zombies. But yes, with that being said, do you find yourself typically, are you the type where you would beat the game and then replay it again with a cheat, or would you play a different mode?
I'd move on to another game.
Okay. Well,
I'm not I invest so wholly in a game that I like to try to as close to 100% it as you can on the first playthrough, that by the time I'm done, I need something else, and I don't really ever have a desire to just go back right then. I will sometimes go back later.
Yeah.
But no, I'm not a right then replay.
I was going to say, I mean, because of this, I'm maybe I should go back and redo 2 or 3 on the PS4.
They are really, really good.
Yeah. Now, out of all the famous locations, what would you say your favorite location in a Resident Evil game has been?
So I know that most people will say the mansion or Raccoon City, but in terms of the games that I've replayed the most, I actually love the settings from 4, the European Village and the castle and the lake and all that. I love those so much because it feels like this world, a mansion that's with zombies and a city with zombies. Absolutely, that's from a horror movie. The European Village and castle in a horror movie is that, that checks more boxes for me.
Yeah.
And honestly, Resident Evil Revelations on the somewhat deserted, infested cruise ship.
Yeah.
I love that setting so much because it just makes me think of whenever the norovirus was happening and all those people on the cruise ships were getting really sick and they were stuck out at port and things like that. I'm like, what would happen if everyone on a ship died and became zombies and somebody had to go clear the ship. Like, that's something interesting that I'd like to see.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I know that out of all of the locations throughout the game, I would probably, like, I mean, the mansion was so iconic.
It is.
But I really love the setup of, like, the functionality of the way that they did in Resident Evil Village, where you had your main village that you kept on going through, but you would pass it to eventually go to, like, to get basically the 4 bosses, and you can, you know, you come back, but it just felt like a whole, like, a live area that all made sense because it had the one hub world with its own little side worlds off to it.
And I think one of the reasons I like the cruise ship so much is that really felt like a Metroidvania setup.
Yeah.
That you're on the ship and you can explore more areas, but it doesn't mean you're not going back to the very start at some point to, oh my gosh, now that I have that key, I remember something way back there that I can unlock. So the setup of Revelations felt very Metroidvania, and you know I enjoy that.
Yes, I know you do. And so out of this entire series, what is your favorite game and why is it Resident Evil 4?
It's like you saw it on the tip of my tongue getting ready to say, it's Resident Evil 4. I like Leon. I like the story. I loved the controls. I enjoyed the scares. I loved the setting of it. To me, Resident Evil 4 was a Resident Evil game that wasn't too scary for me, because honestly, watching you play 7 and 8, I'm not sure if I could do it.
I know you could do it, babe.
I don't know. The 7 was very scary.
Yes, it was. 8 was less scary. After a while, like once you get through that first round of attack, you do start to power up and like feel pretty invincible. So
7 always felt like you were on the defensive the whole game.
Yes, it did. And there were so many things about 7 that were really awesome, and they did really well. I mean, it definitely reinvented the series. But I would also say that probably like going back to like the 2 remake was really one of my favorites in terms of like the story as well as the locations.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it was basically just a great ride all along. I'm really happy that they're making it accessible for the new generation of game consoles, that between the Nintendo Switch and the PlayStation 4, you could pretty much play all of them now if you'd like.
Yeah, and it's a series that, thanks to the remakes that they're doing, is aging well.
Yes.
Because they're going back and fixing some of the ones that were a little wonkier.
Oh, yeah. And definitely if you're interested in them but haven't bought them yet, add them to your wish list and watch them for a month, because I swear once a month they go on sale for 25% off, if not more often than that.
Right now I know that they are for sale on the Switch. 5 and 6 are for $15 each. So my guess is if 5 and 6 are, everything else is as well.
Yes, exactly. So if you haven't played Resident Evil in a while, or you never have, but you love games, go out and give them a try, because they make us so happy.
I suggest if you're a little jumpy like I am, don't turn off all the lights.
Nope, keep a light on so you can play Resident Evil and kill those zombies, or Las Plagas.
Ugh, Plagas.
Yes, and we would love to hear from you as to what your favorite Resident Evil game is and why. You can do that by joining the conversation on our social media.
Yep, you can find us on all the socials, whether that is Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, at Happy Life Pod. Or if you wanted to get in touch with us just super direct,
you can email us at happylifepod@gmail.com.
Well, that is fantastic, I guess. Until next time, everybody,
stay happy. Itchy, tasty
Resident Evil.
Not again. You're still here, which is great, because there's something we probably forgot to mention this episode.
That is correct. Each episode, as we're discussing movies, music, and games, there's a good chance we've used a small clip or two from the original source material.
Yes, and those clips are not ours. We do not own the rights to any of the music or clips. They were used to help solicit a discussion to appreciate the original source material.
And with that, if you are still listening, you likely really appreciate our material as well.
I mean, how could you not? And if you've enjoyed this episode, then you should also ask yourself, when's the last time I told a friend to check out A Lifetime of Happiness?
If your answer was not today, well, it should be.
Yes, so go tell your best squirrel friend about our podcast today, and don't forget to subscribe or follow us wherever you're listening to get new episodes each Wednesday.
stay happy.